Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining Rethinking English Learner Reclassification in California. My name is Lupita Cortez Alcala, and I'll be your host today. I'm excited about this webinar. As many of you know, I'm an English learner, so this is near and dear to my heart, my family, and community. We're glad to have system leaders, advocates, researchers, and community partners here because reclassification sits right at the intersection of instruction, equity, system design, and policy. And in California, these decisions play out under local control. Districts have meaningful discretion on how reclassification criteria are applied, which can create local responsiveness, but also real variation in student experience from one community to the next. We're glad to bring research into this conversation to help ground how California could rethink its approach to EL reclassification. Rethinking means looking at the evidence and being honest about whether our current policies and practices are consistently applied, they are instructionally meaningful and equitable across school and student groups. We'd like to mention that the inspiration for this webinar came out of an informal study group convened by the Assembly Education Committee. Thank you. You are encouraged to ask questions using the Q&A function on your Zoom bar. And if you don't see it, go to More. And if you go to More, you'll find the Q&A, and it'll ask you if you want to pin it to your toolbar. Just say yes. You can also upvote other people's questions that you'd like the panelists to answer at the end of all of the presentations. After the webinar, slides and video for today's webinar will be available for your streaming and downloading on the PACE event page. And our team member Sean can add that link to the chat. Okay, next. Here we go. We are pleased to present a sneak peek of 3 forthcoming research publications on EL reclassification that provide evidence, qualitative and quantitative, on the current status of EL reclassification in California. Diana Mercado Garcia is Associate Director of Research Practice Partnerships with the California Education Partners and is the lead author of the PACE report, Creating Coherence, Lessons on English Learner Reclassification. And Diana will be presenting her co-authors and co-presenters when she presents the report. Our next is Molly Faulkner Bond. She's a research director for the English Learner and Migrant Education Services at WestEd and is the author of the WestEd brief, Finding the Sweet Spot for English Learner Reclassification, a study of California criteria. And we are lucky to have a sneak peek into one of the 56 forthcoming research reports that are part of Getting Down to Facts 3 project to be published in May. Ilana Umensky, I apologize, Associate Professor for the University of Oregon College of Education, will present early findings from her report, Academic Gatekeeping of English Learner Classified Students, the Case of California. Once the speakers present their research, I'll be back to help moderate a Q&A. So why does reclassification matter? It matters because it removes the requirement for designated or sheltered English language development for a classified English learner. It also expands access to grade level coursework and pathways once that you become reclassified. It changes labels, influencing teachers' expectations, placement, and academic self-concept. It's linked to stronger high school completion and college readiness trajectories. It shifts accountability reporting. You go from an English learner progress indicator, and you're now counted as a reclassified fluent English proficient student within that indicator. It can affect district resources and incentives. So these are just some of the reasons that the researchers are going to talk to you about what their findings include. And then just as a recap, for many of you that have joined us, you likely are familiar with these 4 criteria for reclassification. We're going to briefly review them. The first is assessment of English language proficiency. It's using an objective assessment instrument, including but not limited to this state test called the LPAC. It's the English Language Proficiency Assessment for California. And the LPAC is the overall performance level. 4 is the criterion for that test. It's level 4 is the criterion. And then the second is teacher evaluation, including but not limited to review of the student's curriculum mastery, parent opinion and consultation. And then the final one is student performance in basic skills in comparison to against an empirically established range of performance in basic skills of English proficient students of the same age. Districts may use the Smarter Balanced Assessments Consortium test, the SBAC, but they're not required to and may use a local assessment. I want to just remind folks that number 1 is required, but 2, 3, and 4 is locally determined. So 1 is a criterion standardized statewide. Districts determine how to implement the other 3. And unlike California, you may not know, but 33 other states relied exclusively on the English language proficiency assessment for reclassification determinations. But most districts have developed more rigorous reclassification standards than required by state law. So and I mean by most districts in California have developed more rigorous reclassification standards than required by state law. And now I have the pleasure of handing it over to Diana Mercado Garcia. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lupita. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diana Mercado Garcia. I'm the director of the Stanford Sequoia K-12 Research Collaborative and associate director of research practice partnerships at California Education Partners. As Lupita explained, I'm excited to be here today to share with you all a summary of research findings from an upcoming PACE report titled Creating Coherence: Lessons Learned on English Learner Reclassification. Our report spotlights a case of how district leaders implement state reclassification policy at the local level. And I'm joined here today by 2 of our research partners, Laurel Sipes, Senior Associate Researcher at the John W. Gardner Center, and Guillermo Solano Flores, Professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, who you'll hear from in a little bit. Just to contextualize the research findings from which our study emerges, the Stanford Sequoia Collaborative is a research practice partnership between the Graduate School of Education at Stanford and 9 school districts consisting of 8 elementary districts serving grades TK through 8th grade that feed into 1 high school district. Our partnership began in 2017 with a specific focus on better serving the needs of students classified as English learners. And this research focus was selected collaboratively by our participating district leaders who were really interested in learning more about what was leading to the rise of long-term English learners in their district. So these were students who had been in their school system for 5, 6, or 7 years and who were remaining in the category. This shared focus among our 9 district teams led to 2 research inquiries over the course of the last 9 years. The first study took place from 2017 to 2020, and it focused on examining the experiences and academic trajectories of students classified as long-term English learners, or LTELs, to better understand their high school experience. As I mentioned, our collaborative consists of elementary districts, and they weren't always sure what was happening to their students once they got to high school. So this study really helped shed light on that. And the second study picked up where the first one left off to identify actionable steps towards improving reclassification practices across all 9 of our districts. And these 2 studies are featured in our upcoming report. So if you're curious about the research methodologies and the research questions, we encourage you to check out our report when it comes out. So as district leaders engaged in studying the long-term trajectories of students classified as English learners, some of our early phases of our research revealed that school outcomes for students classified as ELs were much worse than for reclassified or non-EL students, especially as they got into high school. And one particularly relevant finding was that there were a portion of LTEL students who were receiving a 4 on the LPEC that were not reclassifying within the year, which was a surprising finding for our district leaders because the key assumption had been that EL and LTEL students were simply not performing well on measures of English language proficiency. And so we are finding that for a good chunk of them, that actually wasn't the case. And so this led us to further investigation about the barriers to reclassification. which suggested that local variability across our 8 districts in basic skills criteria was resulting in unequal reclassification practices, and that there were also administrative procedures contributing to the lack of or delayed reclassification. And most importantly, that basic skills were one of the biggest obstacles to reclassification, especially for students who are obtaining a 4 on the LPAC. So I'm going to pass it along to my colleague Laurel Sipes to share a little bit more detail about what those barriers actually looked like on the ground.
Thank you, Diana. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to illustrate just what some of these barriers looked like in our study districts. So one process barrier that we observed was the way that the 9 districts approached the sequencing of reclassification when we started this study in 2021-22. So we observed that all districts started their annual reclassification cycle upon receipt of the LPAC results. So you can see on the chart here that LPAC is administered between February and May, and districts typically start to receive LPAC results mid to late May and then extending through the summer. So the timing of the release of these data was affecting when reclassification could happen, whether it was the end of the school year or the beginning of the next school year. The timing of the basic skills assessment, so the next row, depends on which assessment districts use. So if they use CASP, that's a spring administration, kind of on a similar timeline to LPAC. It might be another assessment that has a 3 times a year, fall, winter, spring timeline. It might be a more flexible assessment that can be administered monthly or at the district's discretion. But what we observed is that districts waited until they, typically at this time, waited until they received their LPAC results, looked to see who got a 4, and then turned their attention to let's look at their basic skills results, which almost always was happening the next fall. Then teacher evaluations typically didn't start until LPAC and basic skills criteria had been met, so a little later in the fall, September to November, at which point the student has a new teacher and they maybe have only been working with them for a few weeks, and they're being asked for input about the student's readiness to reclassify. And finally, the parent consultation is happening after all 3 of those other criteria have been met. The cycle has a natural kind of built-in endpoint when the next summative LPAC testing window opens on February 1st. And at that point, any student who hasn't reclassified, even if they passed the LPAC the previous year, must take the LPAC again. Next slide, please. Another barrier that Diana alluded to earlier was that of district to district variation in one, which assessments districts use for their basic skills requirements, and 2, the performance thresholds that they're setting. So this slide shows the real basic skills criteria used by 3 of the 9 districts in 2022-23 when we were gathering this information for the first time from the 9 districts. And you can see District 1, they use the CASP assessment and a performance level of standard met. So that's a 1 test, 1 time a year, met proficiency. That's what they use for basic skills. District 2 also use CASP, but at the level 2 threshold, or the iReady, it meets grade level, and a district rating assessment at the approaches standards. And District 3 also uses CASP at the level 2, and also required Lexile score of 1,110 on the reading inventory. So you can see one district using one assessment, others using multiple. Some of these assessments are administered once per year, others multiple times per year. And we can see different thresholds used on the same assessments across districts. And we observed this type of variation across all 9 districts. Next slide. We as a collaborative spent much of 2022 and 23 building understanding among the districts of these differences in the basic skills criteria and building agreement, collective agreement around how the 8 districts could shift the way that they define the basic skills criterion and implement it, the processes they use. 1, to be more aligned with each other and aligned with the high school district receiving their students. 2, to not pose a barrier to students who were achieving a 4 on the LPAC. And 3, to be more equitable to EL students given the average performance of their peers in the district. So all 9 districts made at least 1 change to their basic skills criterion. This slide shows some of the types of changes that they made. So some lowered their CASP cut score from standard met, that 3 level, to standard nearly met, the 2 level. Some reduced cut scores on other assessments they might use for basic skills. They might reduce the number of requirements where you see it's CASP and another assessment. They might have shifted it to or, one or the other. And for offering additional opportunities, so more of a menu of options of, did you meet a threshold on assessment A or assessment B or assessment C that are offered throughout the school year, giving students more opportunities to demonstrate their readiness. Next slide, please. This slide shows the share of students across all 9 districts who achieved a 4 on the LPAC and reclassified within the next calendar year among the 9 districts that we were studying. So the orange bar are students who are EL, so an EL status for 6 years or fewer, and the teal bar are the LTEL students in these 9 districts. And you can see a nice encouraging upward trend for both groups. When the collaborative started its work together, you can see fewer than half of students who got a 4 on the LPAC were reclassifying before the next LPAC started. And in the most recent year, we can see nearly all students who got a 4 on the LPAC were reclassifying. And we're especially encouraged to see the shrinking gap between EL and LTEL students, and we observed a similar trend for duly identified students. After the districts began implementing these changes to their basic skills criterion in 2022-23, we spent the next couple of years studying the early implementation of those policy changes, as well as the early academic outcomes of students who reclassified under these new basic skills criteria. So we tracked students who reclassified in 7th or 8th grade under the new criteria and tracked them into 9th and 10th grade to see how they were doing academically. And some in the collaborative were worried that these students wouldn't perform well enough once they reached high school. But what we saw is that students, 70% were passing their 10th grade A to G English course. You can see their average GPA, and that we're on track earning 74 A to G credits by the end of 10th grade towards that 150 A to G credits that you expect to complete A to G. For those who are interested, we can speak more after today's session about more of the quantitative analysis we did. And now I'll hand the presentation over to Professor Solanas Flores to discuss our policy recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you. So one important takeaway here is that using too many criteria does not lead to more accurate classifications of students. We know that this might sound counterintuitive because as educators, we are often trying to promote academic excellence by looking at multiple aspects of student learning. However, research consistently shows that relying on too many criteria is not only ineffective, it can also be unfair. The first reason is that many of these additional criteria are not directly related to English proficiency. For example, the development of basic skills is not necessarily connected to the kind of proficiency students need to be functional and active learners. We need to keep in mind that learning English is not the same as learning in English, and is not the same as learning about English. The students' mastery's basic skills can vary tremendously, regardless of their proficiency in their first or only language or in their second language. So the second reason is that using too many criteria tends to delay reclassification. This in turn reduces students' opportunities to continue developing their second language naturally. For example, through social interaction in the classroom, at school, and in academic contexts. And the third reason is that adding more criteria significantly increases schools' administrative burden. This makes the reclassification process more complex and often leads to further delays. And this is not a minor issue. As we discussed earlier in the presentation, many students who should be reclassified are not reclassified in a timely manner because of district's procedures and scheduling constraints. So we can move to the next comment, please. Diane, thank you.
Thanks so much. So we will go ahead and pass it over to Molly Faulkner-Bond from WestEd.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Excited to be a part of this session. I am going to be presenting high-level findings from a forthcoming paper from WestEd called Finding the Sweet Spot for English Learner Reclassification, a study of California's criteria. This QR code will take you to where the report will be posted, which I'm hoping will be someday this week. I want to just acknowledge that the work I'm about to share was done by many people, both at WestEd and within the California Department of Education. So just want to acknowledge the many collaborators who contributed to the findings I'm about to share. The paper summarizes a study we completed collaboratively between WestEd and a CDE that had two sort of overarching goals. So we looked at student-level statewide assessment data to answer two key questions. So first, is the criterion 1 threshold on the LPAC still in the right place? And what does meeting that threshold on the LPAC tell us about English learners' academic preparedness and potential achievement? And I want to give a little bit of framing for why we did this work, because I think it will help make sense of sort of why we did things the way we did and also how we interpreted the findings. So one motivator was sort of a best practices need by the CDE just to affirm and validate the state's existing criteria on the LPAC, or criterion, I should say. The current thresholds on the LPAC were set in 2018-19. And they were based on data from the first year that the LPAC was in operational administration, 2017-18. And so the methods were rigorous. They represented best practice. The CDE looked at the data several ways, engaged with the state board. They're solid. But we know that as an assessment is used for longer periods of time, it can affect what is taught, how is taught, the achievement distributions of students on that test. And so I think the CDE was interested in just seeing, 5 years later, do we still see that the thresholds are sort of holding up their meaning and placement relative to when the test was first introduced? A second motivation was the state's awareness of just differences between California's exit policy compared to other states. So WestEd did a scan of state websites and policies for the 23-24 school year, and we found that almost all states relied solely on data from their English language proficiency assessment. Some of them did use multiple scores from that assessment, but there were very few states that still used multiple criteria of any kind beyond the ELP assessment in the 23-24 school year. And California is the only one that still requires 4 different criteria, 4 different sources of evidence for reclassification. And so not that California needs to match what other states are doing, but presumably everyone is doing their best to be sort of thoughtful here and achieve their goals. And so the fact that California is so out of step is notable. The CDE was also hearing feedback from the field expressing concerns about the state's criteria, and particularly criterion 4. So one of the other things we did during the 23-24 school year was collaborate with the CDE to host some listening sessions with educators about their thoughts on reclassification. And when asked about the most common barrier to reclassification, many participants did point to criterion 4 and expressed concern that the standards that they used would be difficult for English-only students to meet, and that it was unfair for English learners to have to meet these standards that might be challenging for English-only students to meet. So against that backdrop, we engaged in a number of different analyses. Again, first we looked simply at the thresholds on the LPAC, and we essentially replicated the same analyses that were done in 2018-19 to set that threshold in the first place. We used 3 different methods of trying to identify an appropriate threshold. They're the same methods that were used in the original analysis, and they come from a federally commissioned report out of the U.S. Department of Education that proposes quantitative methods states can use to set language proficiency exit criteria. And across these 3 methods, they offer many different ways to think about where we might set an exit threshold. So they allow us to identify the level of ELP where English learners have a roughly 50% chance of attaining proficiency on academic content assessments. And the 50% is intentional because we're trying to find a place where we're confident that language is not the thing that's driving your academic achievement. So chance means hopefully that students, what we're seeing is their academic achievement and not their language proficiency. We can also look for the level of ELP where English learners' academic achievement most closely resembles that of English-only students. And we can look for the level of ELP where we have sort of the most consistent results between ELA and ELP. So students are proficient on both tests or neither, which is maybe desirable in terms of consistency. And so across all of those different methods, we might get different results for different grades or different methods, and you have to sort of synthesize and decide what to recommend. In California's case, it was actually very straightforward. All of the methods and all of the grades converged on LPAC overall performance level 4 as the optimal cut score for exiting students from status. That's the same finding that the state and WestEd found in 2018-19. So it's been robust over time and it's robust over grade. So that's great news for the state that the LPAC threshold continues to be strong and appropriate. We then turn to the question of what meeting that threshold actually tells us about students' academic preparedness. And I'm actually going to skip ahead to show why we wanted to look at that. So this is a set of results from one of the methods that we use to check the LPAC threshold. And what we're looking at here are the achievement distributions on the SBAC English Language Arts test. The vertical axis is the score scale for that test. And each of these boxes is the distribution of scores for different groups of students. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are students with different levels of ELP as measured by the LPAC. So the 1 is all the students who scored at overall level 1 on the LPAC. And then you can see we have English-only students, IFEP students, and RFEP students. And so what we hope to see is something like our grade 4 result, where the average achievement and the general distribution for students at LPAC level 4 is similar to that of English-only students. That suggests these two groups are scoring kind of comparably on the assessment. And when you look at all students in the state, what you see is that as we go up in the grades, there is still a little bit of an achievement gap between LPAC level 4 students and English-only students, which suggests that we need criterion 4 as an additional source of evidence. But that does also go against the things that we heard from educators in those listening sessions, and also some of the things that our colleagues at Stanford shared in the previous presentation. So, go backward. What we basically tried to do is compare English learners to more similar peers. We know that students tend to attend school with students with comparable background characteristics, particularly when it comes to parental education and also socioeconomic status. So students are not kind of randomly sorted into schools with anybody. If you have parents who didn't finish high school, you're more likely to be in a school with other students whose parents didn't finish high school. And so when we compared English learners to English-only students who had similar background characteristics, what we basically found is that the results reversed. So here now we're looking at the same display, but for students whose parents did not finish high school. And what you can see is that in the lower grades, English learners at LPAC level 4 are actually outperforming English-only students by a fairly considerable margin on average. And even in 7th grade, there's still a little bit of a differential with the EL level 4 students still outperforming. And that held all the way through 11th grade, that they did better than, or at least as well as, English-only students with comparable background characteristics. So we did that for all levels of parent education, students who met the state's criterion for socioeconomic disadvantage, and students with disabilities. And students at LPAC level 4 outperformed English-only students in every group except for students who were not socioeconomically disadvantaged. And that represents about 15% of all English learners in the state. So this suggests, again, it sort of reinforces this perception that educators have that criterion 4 is not necessary and perhaps unfair. What these data suggest is that English learners who can meet LPAC overall level 4 are already showing that they can meet academic standards. And that's in part because of the way that the LPAC standard was set in the first place. It took academic achievement into account when it was set. Just quickly, we did also look at how students who scored at LPAC overall performance level 4 went on to achieve in the next school year. And what we found is there was essentially no difference whether students exited from English learner status or remained in English learner status. Their subsequent math and ELA scores were the same in the next school year. And there's various ways you could read that, but our interpretation is that that suggests there is no academic benefit from remaining in EL status for an extra year. And given that we know there are costs to remaining in English learner status related to access and opportunity, the argument would probably be to exit students, given that there's no clear benefit to them staying in status. So Again, we think that when meeting the LPAC threshold tells us that students can do as well or better as peers from similar backgrounds. So essentially the LPAC threshold sort of already accomplishes what criterion 4 is intended to accomplish. So in terms of what our findings mean, we have sort of 4 recommendations to consider for a policy perspective. So we do think there's strong evidence that LPAC overall level 4 is a strong and appropriate threshold for criterion 1, and the state should keep it. But we agree with the previous presenters that it's worth considering removing criterion 4. It's not clear that it's needed, and it's not clear that it's fair. If criterion 4 is removed, the state might also consider the value of maintaining criteria 2 and 3. There are, again, the more criteria there are, the less likely students will exit. It creates barriers. And again, most states do not use these as part of their reclassification policy. The state might consider using additional criteria, in particular pre-specified circumstances. So if there are sort of borderline cases where it's unclear what to do, perhaps for a student with disabilities, then you might introduce additional criteria. We also recommend that there's some practice considerations. I'll just sort of show these now, but move on because I know I'm running on time. But I think there are also considerations for just how we can also sort of reduce the impact of reclassification and make sure that we are designing systems with student thriving and success in mind beyond simply policy compliance. And so I will now pass it over to my colleague, Ilana Umansky. And again, our report should be coming out this week. There's a QR code here and a link if you want to subscribe to our newsletter to get an update. You can also find me on LinkedIn when it's out, and appreciate the opportunity to share. I'll pass it over to Ilana.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Yeah, I'm Ilana Umansky from the University of Oregon, and I'm going to be presenting some hot off the press results from a study that I've been conducting with my colleague Havisha Khurana, and with special thanks to the California Department of Education and the Learning Policy Institute. As Lupita mentioned at the beginning, this is one of a number of studies that will be coming out in May as part of Getting Down to Facts. Our particular study is aimed at understanding how criterion 4, so the academic criterion for reclassification, is operating and what impact it's having on students around the state. Let's see, okay. So while originally conceived as a purely administrative shift in status, we now know that reclassification changes students' instructional settings and can shift their trajectories. Thus, reclassification matters not on its own, but in relation to the educational experiences of English learner classified students, of reclassified students, as well as the pacing and manner of any shifts as students approach reclassification and then are reclassified. So we've heard a bunch today from these wonderful studies about the relative complexity of California's reclassification criteria. And in particular, we know that the basic skills criterion has credible arguments both for and against it. Ultimately, then, California has a reclassification system in which students may find themselves English proficient, where that's measured as LPAC level 4, but ineligible to be reclassified because they fail to reach their specific district's basic skills benchmark. So it's in the context of this that our study asks the following questions. How do districts define their basic skills criteria? How many students meet basic skills criteria compared to English proficiency criteria? And then how does being held in EL status impact otherwise eligible English proficient students? And there, we're going to look at how these effects differ both across and within districts based on their basic skills difficulty level. So for this study, we combined longitudinal student level data from the California Department of Education with data that we hand collected and coded about districts' unique reclassification criteria. We collected data from a stratified random sample of districts that ultimately consisted of 112,000 student year observations across the 2022 and 2023 school years. So that represents about 11% of the state. And as you can see in this table, our sample ultimately reflects the state quite closely. So our first question asked about how and where districts set their basic skills reclassification criteria. And what we found, and Diana really alluded to this earlier in their partnership, is that districts vary widely, both in terms of the thresholds they set, the proficiency levels they require, and the operationalization of the basic skills criteria. So first, we found that most districts, and this is about 80% of districts, allow students multiple pathways to meet the basic skills criterion. So usually what this meant is that a student could pass either the SBAC or one or more alternative assessments of English language arts. But a small number of districts that we call SBAC and districts were districts where they required that students meet a given threshold on the SBAC and additional ELA assessments throughout the year. And in the middle is a group of about 10 districts, 10% of districts that were SBAC only required the SBAC. Districts also varied, you can see here at the bottom part of the table, in the proficiency level they required, 2, 3, or somewhere between 2 and 3. So in summary, the difficulty of the basic skills criterion varied widely across districts. Our second research question asked how many students met basic skills compared to English language proficiency criteria in their districts. And here, oh my goodness, sorry about that. Whoa, that was my mouse doing something crazy, so sorry. Oh my gosh. I'm not sure what's happening. Sorry, guys. Let me see if I can just do it with my... Okay, here we go. I'm gonna do it with my fingers. So here we found that the proportion of students who meet the SBAC criteria is actually higher than the proportion of students meeting the LPAC criteria on average across our district. So 26.6% compared to 21.1%. So in general, the SBAC threshold was actually easier, more attainable than the LPAC threshold. But this wasn't true for all students. Smaller percentages of students cleared the SBAC threshold in each subsequent grade, such that by the time students entered 7th grade, they were more likely to meet the LPAC criterion than the SBAC threshold in their district. We also saw important variation by district setting. So SBAC pass rates were by far the lowest, as you can see down here at the bottom of this graph, in rural settings. And in these settings, LPAC pass rates were higher than SBAC pass rates. So together, what this tells us is that students who are most likely to be held back by the criterion number 4, the academic criterion, are middle and high school students and those that are in rural settings. Okay, moving on to our regression discontinuity results, we found that in general, being held in English learner status did not negatively or positively impact student outcomes. So Molly just talked about having a similar finding in her study. Students with lower prior year SBAC scores in general performed worse the subsequent year, and you can see that by this upward sloping line in ELA and in math in these graphs. But at the threshold, which is shown here by that red circle, there was no difference on average in students who hit the threshold and were reclassified and those who did not. So English proficient students who are held back performed the same as their peers who were reclassified. There was one possible exception here, though, and that related to truancy or attendance. So these results were not statistically significant, but they were consistent across all of our models and they were of meaningful magnitude. So specifically what we found is that being held in EL status, once English proficient, had a direct impact of 19 percentage points, increasing your likelihood of being truant in the subsequent year. Lastly, we wanted to know if the effects of being held in English learner status were different in districts that had easier versus harder basic skills criteria. And here it's useful to pause for a second and think about theory. So conventional frameworks would suggest that when criteria are too strenuous, and I'm circling the box here, students are held unnecessarily in EL status and do worse because of it. We see that stylized scenario here, where students below that threshold, that dotted line, do worse when in districts that have strenuous criteria. Conventional frameworks also suggest that when criteria are too low, students are reclassified out of EL status earlier than they should be, and they flounder in general education. So here, students below the threshold do better when they're held in EL status in these lenient districts. So either scenario can help policymakers evaluate if the basic skills criterion is working well. But what we find is results that really call this entire framework into question. We find that students who are held in EL status once English proficient do significantly better, and this is of meaningful size, if and only if they are in districts with harder basic skills criterion. So what this seems to suggest, again, using this old framework, is that basic skills thresholds are too low only in places that set them higher. So you can see that it's really calling into question that entire framework. So what does this mean? To us, it means that the conventional framework really isn't holding up. But as I mentioned earlier, we're learning that reclassification can't be understood without taking into account the experiences and supports for students both EL classified and RFEP identified. So we think that our results indicate that in districts with more strenuous criteria, there's likely a shock in instructional supports that results in decreased performance of these recently reclassified students. We don't have data, unfortunately, to test this. We don't have data on instructional supports, but we can at least start to test our theory by seeing if the characteristics of districts that set harder thresholds are different than those that set easier thresholds. That's shown in the table here, and we see that yes, on average, these districts are quite different from each other. Harder basic skills districts have fewer Latino ELs, more Asian ELs, more newcomers, and they're likely to be in different kinds of locales. So while this is not at all definitive, we think it points to important differences between these different district types. And just one more point I'll make, which is that if instructional context didn't matter, we'd expect to see that districts with the same or similar reclassification criteria would also have the same effects of being held in EL status or being reclassified. But when we look within a group of districts with the same or similar criteria, and this is shown here in the figure on the right, we see wide variation in reclassification effects. We see positive effects, negative effects, statistically significant effects, non-statistically significant effects. So this again is suggesting that it's not just the place in which the criteria is set, it's the relationship of instruction to criteria. So very briefly, takeaways are that districts vary widely in their operationalization and level of the basic skills criterion, that many districts appear to be setting their criteria in ways that minimize barriers to reclassification. However, the criterion continues to pose challenges for certain groups of students, and in particular for students in higher grade levels and those in rural settings. We don't find any average meaningful effect of being held in EL status on academic or behavioral outcomes in the subsequent year on average, although there is a possible negative effect of being held in status on attendance. Our results, moreover, though, challenge conventional frameworks. We find positive academic effects of being held in EL status only in districts with harder basic skills criteria. And we think that this might be driven by service and support disconnects in these districts or weaknesses on one or the other side of supports for multilingual students. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all our presenters. Now it's time for our panelist Q&A. I know that we've been madly working on responding to your Q&A. Again, if you don't see the Q&A, click on the More button on the bottom and it says Q&A pinned to your, go ahead and pin to your toolbar and say yes, and you'll be able to answer some questions. Okay, I think one of the questions I think is going to go to either Ilana or to Molly that was in the Q&A, and I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see it or maybe it was just answered. So now it's been answered. It had to do with let's see, I have it in my text thread too. just really quick. Is a higher performance of reclassified students evidence of a better criteria? If it is harder to get reclassified, even with simpler criteria, wouldn't the kids who do get reclassified will have higher scores on future assessments by construction?
I'm happy to start and then definitely invite others to weigh in. I think the answer is sort of, it depends. So I think one thing I hear in this question is we often point to high achievement of RFEP students as evidence that a reclassification criterion is good. And I think what we need to remember is that often the kids who reclassify earliest are sort of the top of the achievement distribution for English learners. So we're really looking at like one slice of a larger group of students. And the goal is not for, we want all kids to succeed, of course, and we want all kids to meet high standards, but we have to remember that there are opportunity costs associated with being in English learner status. And so I think sometimes we think, well, if we just hold them back and have higher standards, then when they can meet those standards, they'll do better. But in the meantime, sometimes keeping them in English learner status can actually undermine their ability to meet those high standards over time. And so it can actually sort of backfire. And this intervention that we think is supposed to help students meet this high standard actually prevents them from doing so. So I think it's really nuanced. I don't think we necessarily want to discount the importance of making sure that our English learners are ready to meet challenging criteria, but we also again, there are equity considerations within schools and within districts, and there are plenty of kids who are not English learners and who are not proficient in English and math, and they're still allowed to take grade level math while English learners may not be. So we just want to make sure that we're being equitable. And I think the other thing I would flag, and then I'll stop talking, but is also just remembering that some of this is about the policy, but a lot of this is about instruction and programs for students. So if our goal is for English learners to meet high standards, one way to do that is to set reclassification policy, but another way is to improve our programs and the quality of instruction and essentially make it matter less whether they're in EL status or out of EL status. If everybody is getting outstanding math instruction, then we can take a little pressure off of ourselves and the students about where exactly the threshold is set on the basic skills criterion.
Great, thank you. I have a question. What role should the state play in standardizing or revising reclassification practices to reduce district level variability while still respecting local control? This is open to all.
I can start. Since so much of our study did focus on the basic skills criterion, and that's where we see a tremendous amount of variation district to district in how they define it. There are different ways to view this as a problem or not. One is this variation reflects a lot of local latitude that the state policy offers. And we see it as a acute problem when we're working with districts that feed into the same high school district, and the high school district is saying we're getting students who are being reclassified at really different thresholds and using different assessments. And that's problematic for the non-unified districts in the state. One approach is to say, and what we have recommended is to do away with that criterion. Another would be to provide a lot more guidance to districts for harmonizing and support for implementing a different basic skills criterion. It's not that eliminating it is the only answer, but there are a variety of approaches the state could take to bring more alignment.
Yeah, and I will also share that, as I mentioned, our partnership started in 2017, and our district leaders, the case that we present really shows how long it took for 9 of our districts to achieve that level of coherence through a partnership that is pretty intensive and provides a lot of support and space to have those conversations. And so even though it's possible to achieve some level of alignment with those basic skills, with the basic skills criteria. It really would have helped to have state guidance to help expedite some of that coherence building and alignment among our 9 districts. So, yeah.
I would like to add that the fact that we have this variability is because there's not much clarity about exactly what those basic skills would contribute to more accurate classifications. We have to keep in mind that one of the things that hurt ELs more is implementation. When you have this variability in the ways in which criteria are implemented, not only in this case, in the case of reclassification, but for example, accommodations for English learners, then we have a lot of problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, there's a couple more questions in here. Let's see. One of the questions. Does this variability run counter to the federal requirement of having standardized statewide criteria?
Yeah, I would argue that yes, I think it does. I think California is quite unique in interpreting federal law, which states that there should be standardized statewide entrance and exit procedures in place. California interprets that very differently than other states in the amount of local control that it provides. I'll just say one other thing about this, which is that I think there's always a balance between centralization and decentralization, and one of the arguments around centralization is about equity. And one of the arguments around decentralization is really about local control. And I would just say that we know that English learner classified students face many inequities in school, and because of that broader context of the deep inequities that English learner classified students face, I would argue that a more centralized classification and reclassification system with less local control makes sense, because that focus on equity for those students is really critical.
Thank you, Ilana. And then the next question, since you're still on here, is regarding your work. How did you handle grade level differences in the basic skills criterion? Did you look at each grade as its own band or at specific groups of grades? I am part of a team looking at contents of the EL master plan and we've seen a wide range in the ways districts handle different grades and are having trouble thinking through how to do this. Thanks in advance.
Yeah, great questions. Yes. So the reason why we ended up with a sample that is 11% of the state is because it was very work intensive to get the reclassification criteria for those districts. And we coded grade by grade, and then we evaluated impact grade by grade. So keeping in mind the district's grade specific reclassification criteria. Just a couple of other things about that. One is that we did not include grades where the SBAC is not used, because our CDE data included SBAC test scores and no other test scores. And then the other thing I'll mention that I didn't have time to say is that we did look to see if reclassification effects or being held in EL status one's English proficient, the effects of that differed by grade band, and we did not see any statistically significant differences between elementary grades and secondary grades.
Thank you. Okay, there's a question from Tony. If approximately 44 states only use the ELP as a criteria for reclassification, and California is the only state with 4 criteria, why not use one criteria if the feds only mandate ELP as a criteria? Additionally, California criteria has been in existence for over 50 years. This might have been a Molly question.
I agree, Tony. I think that's the question. I think that's what I think all of us are maybe trying to raise. Is it time to revisit and reconsider? The state has had this policy in place for a long time. It's based on, I think, valid concerns about wanting to make sure that services aren't removed while students still have a right to them. But I think that the evidence today overwhelmingly suggests that that is not really how this policy is functioning. And so I think it is worth considering making a change.
And Molly, since you're still up, there's another question. Back to your Molly mentioned about reclassification sweet spot. It seems like the instructional supports before and after RFEP are really the difference maker. What do you see as the minimum set of supports districts should have in place to reclassify responsibly? And given the wide variability across LEAs in California, how do we reconcile that with a consistent policy framework? Also, where does Optel fit into the conversation? How should it be used or not used in reclassification decisions? Brandy from
Okay.
Oakland.
Love the mention. So the OPTEL is the Observation Protocol for Teachers of English Learners, which was developed to support standardizing reclassification, but also has formative uses. So I'll speak to this, but I know others on this panel can probably say even more. I just think this is exactly the right question, because all of the work that we're doing doesn't matter if English learners get access to high quality, rigorous, excellent instruction in English learner status and after they exit from English learner status. So the way that you make all this go away and none of it matter is if you have outstanding integrated and designated ELD and strong monitoring. And so I do think, just to linger on monitoring for a moment, I think this is an area where so many states, California's not alone on this, do not have anything standardized. They don't have collect anything. There's not a lot of guidance. And so it often ends up being a very compliance oriented activity where maybe you check data once a year and say, the kid's not failing, so they're fine. And, or if anything does happen, it's usually focused on putting students back into English learner status and not on helping them continue to thrive outside of English learner status. So I do think there are great opportunities to try to introduce more guidance and intentionality in the monitoring space. That is something where the state could play a role, but I think it would also probably need a lot of local thought and support. In terms of what it would actually look like, I'll defer to my colleagues who have more kind of pedagogical expertise in classroom level, but I do think that it's just exactly the right question to ask.
Great. Go ahead. Yes.
I was just going to add, from our sample of 9 districts in our collaborative, when we did interview about their monitoring processes, and it was very much what Molly was saying, a compliance activity and non-standardized across the 9. And also folks raised questions about, that they felt like they rarely saw students once they RFEP'd who were struggling academically because of English language proficiency, but it was almost always some other reading challenge, and that they felt like, okay, our MTSS system is going to capture these students and we have interventions to support students who need help in reading, and that it was rarely a case of it was because of English proficiency.
Thank you. A question from Cindy. Hi, Cindy. Can you share more about students who are considered EL proficient, truant, or have higher rates of chronic absenteeism?
So, can you share more information about students who are considered EL proficient, truant, or, well, Cindy, we didn't look, maybe others have other things to say about this. We didn't actually look at like the level of truancy for EL classified students or RFEP classified students. We have that data, but we haven't looked at it. What we are looking at is that, we think that being reclassified and by contrast being held in EL status once English proficient can impact you in different ways. And some of those have to do, and Lupita mentioned this at the beginning, have to do with your sense of belonging in school, whether you feel like you're valued, whether you want to be there, whether you think the instructional settings you're in are challenging and exciting, whether you're allowed to enroll in electives, all these things. So we think that one place in which that shows up is on attendance, and that because we know that English learner classification often comes with barriers to access, our theory was that being held in EL status might actually have a downward impact on attendance. And that is exactly what we're seeing. As I said, it's not statistically significant, but it was across all subgroups, across all district types, across all models, grade bands. We saw this very sizable difference in at the threshold of students who were held in EL status versus not held in EL status.
Great, thank you so much. I know, I think our time has almost come to an end. I know there was a question about bringing these recommendations to legislators. PACE is nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Many of the other organizations, what we do is elevate the research, provide it, and inform policymakers, and we hope they do something about it. And I know that there's quite a few staff members from perhaps the legislature may be on this webinar, so I'm hoping that they've received this and they'll have access to all the information like many of you will. I just wanted to thank again the presenters for being here today. Thank the participants for taking the time to be here as well, and remind you all that yes, you will have access to the recording of this presentation as well as the slides on our event web site on our event site on the web, the PACE website at the conclusion. I'm not sure exactly timing, but we'll hope to let you know when that's ready. Thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we appreciate your time.